are you all this evening?
That's fine.
Good, good,
Good,
good.
thanks.
It's a hard time. I've gotten tired of saying it, and it's not even insightful, but somehow each time I say it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's why I feel this way. It's a hard time. Hey, I see Sister V is here. Hello, hello. Great. I'm just delighted that you all have joined in for this. And I'm hoping, and I think it will. I'm very struck by this book. I've not read it before, so I'm very struck by it. So let's how about if we start with prayer? Sister V, you want to start us off, and then we'll go from there.
Sounds like a plan if I unmute myself.
Fair enough.
So let us pray. God, help us to change ourselves and to change our world, to know the need for it, to deal with the pain of it, to feel the joy of it, to undertake the journey without understanding the destination. Let us engage wholeheartedly in the art of gentle revolution. Amen.
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 Yeah.
Gentle revolution. Well, we could spend 35 minutes unpacking that.
Yes, I borrowed that one from Michael Linig.
I thought in the midst of this Advent season that this is that time where we know it's waiting and it's preparing and tilling, and I just think of sort of tilling my inner soil with whatever time I can find. But that as the days keep getting darker earlier, I try to push myself to more reflective moments. And for me, Advent always is this notion of seeing again and knowing again the truth of God coming into the world for the first time. It's this truth. I know it, and every Advent is my deep abiding prayer that it may hit me, perhaps smack me on the side of the head, that it may become known to me in a way that enables me to understand it as like, oh, it's new. So I think that's what I'm thinking about with a book that was published the year I was born. And then we can see what has and what hasn't changed. And so let me just give you a little bit of thoughts. Tonight we're gonna discuss the first letter. The second week, and we'll put this out on the website and then the next newsletter, but the second week we're gonna essentially do what is the spiritual autobiography for Baldwin. And that's pages 15 through 47. So you want to read up to page 47 next week if you're just sort of in there and just doing the reading as we go. Third week is going to be Baldwin's encounter with Islam and separatism. This is how Sister V categorized it. And that's page 48 through 82. And then the last week which will be, by my judgment, is that what, 2 days before Christmas? It's the eve of Christmas Eve. And since we
Yeah.
all won't be out at the malls, that we'll read from page 83 to the end. But as we were talking about this, one of the things Sister V was talking about was how much she felt like she was filling in and backfilling in terms of the context. And we thought that might be a place to start, kind of with a timeline. And so, Sister V, if you want to take it away with that.
Okay. So this timeline is by no means all inclusive. I was kind of looking at the things that affected James Baldwin when he was writing this book and what was going on while he was writing it, what might have informed some of the essays that he wrote. And so I was just kind of thinking of the background information that I was filling in when I was doing this, and let's see if I can share this.
And if you have questions, just please write them in the chat. And comments. This is the hard part, friends.
Right, exactly.
Prepare and wait for the share screen. You'll notice I'm not the one trying to share it. Don't worry, Sister V, we're not all watching you.
Right, exactly.
If it's not working, you can also use the link in the chat and that'll open it up in the browser, which is sometimes easier to share.
Ah, okay.
Whoa, that's the voice of Anna.
Okay, there we go. Right, that took forever, but here we go.
Round of applause. And this is the part, but there you go. This is the part where I always say to Ken and Hardy, could you make that bigger?
And I always need mine bigger.
All right.
So yeah, this is, like I said, this is not all exclusive. It starts with the first African slaves being brought to the British colony in Jamestown, keeping in mind that the Spanish started bringing slaves into North America in the mid 1500s.
Wow.
So we go through the American Revolution, enslaved and free Blacks fight on both sides. Then we have the 3/5 Compromise, which decides that slaves being, because of racism, deciding that they're not fully human, that they count as 3/5 of the person. And it gives slave-holding states kind of a disproportionate power in Congress. In 1808, bringing slaves from Africa into the US is banned, but smuggling continues until 1861. Going on, there's this kind of movement to maybe send free Blacks back to Africa because there's this fear that they will outnumber whites in the US and they don't want Blacks to have that much power. In 1857, just on the eve of the Civil War, there's the Dred Scott decision where the Supreme Court says that, if someone's enslaved and they're transported to a free state, they're not free. They remain enslaved and the property of their owners no matter where they are. We go into the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation comes along in 1863. 1865, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, but allows enforced unpaid servitude as punishment for crime, which allows imprisoned people to basically be re-enslaved. 1865, on Juneteenth, the last enslaved people learn of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, these are statistics I got actually from the Library of Congress and the Bureau of the Census, because when Bishop Bonnie and I were talking about this, we're like, what were the numbers? So approximately 12 million people were kidnapped and brought to the Americas in the Atlantic slave trade. Only about 5% ended up in what became the United States. And at its height, America had about 3.9 million enslaved Black people. By 1860, at the eve of the Civil War, 89% of the Black population of the US were enslaved. And in 2 states, South Carolina and Mississippi, the enslaved Black population outnumbered the white population. So after the Civil War, the 15th Amendment extends suffrage to Black men. Women have to wait longer. But then we enter the era of Reconstruction, where the political and social gains that were enshrined by the amendments to the Constitution were met with increasing violence from whites in the South. And that's this time we get the first rise of the Ku Klux Klan. So the Compromise of 1877 is where the newly elected President Hayes withdraws federal troops from the South. And without the protection of those troops, the rights of Blacks are curtailed through white violence. And that's when we see Jim Crow laws and the escalation of lynching. Now, on another continent, back in Africa, there is this scramble for what's called the Scramble for Africa. And Baldwin will touch on this later in his essays. But in 1881, about 10% of the continent was colonized by white Europeans. But by 1914, the eve of World War I, 90% of the continent was subject to colonial rule. And in the 1890s, lynching continued to escalate. And I.W. Wells was the primary documentarian of that. And she eventually has to flee Memphis, Tennessee, where she's been, writing about these acts, and she has to flee because of the threats to her life. 1896, the Supreme Court upholds segregation. Again, on the African continent, you have the colonial powers really clamping down and trying to just grasp as much land and resources as they can. And this is where we actually find the first concentration camps. The German colonial power in what is now Namibia transported 2 nations of people, the Herero and the Nama, by cattle car on railways to death camps. And about 65,000 people, it's estimated, were massacred during that time. 1909, back here in the States, the NAACP is formed. World War I comes along. Black Americans are recruited and served when the US joins the war in 1917. 1914, the United Negro Improvement Association is formed. You might be familiar with the name Marcus Garvey. And this is the first wave of Pan-Africanism, this idea that Africans, no matter where they are in the world, should unite to fight for their rights and for equality. And at the same time, there's the second resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. This is the beginning of the Great Migration of Blacks from the South to the North in search of safety and, decent paying jobs, which they weren't finding in the South. And at the end of World War I, the former European colonies held by Germany and Africa are divided among the victorious allies. So you have largely France and England and Britain being the colonial powers in Africa. 1921, we have the Tulsa race riot, where the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma was destroyed by white mob violence. Malcolm X is born in 1925. 1929, Martin Luther King is born. 1930, the Nation of Islam, which Baldwin will encounter later on in this book, is formed here in Detroit. 1939, World War II begins. And Africans from both the colonies in the continent of Africa, and of course here in the US, join, though there's debate within the Black community over whether to join to prove their right to full citizenship or to object to service because of the denial of their freedoms within the US. World War II ends, and returning Blacks, they push harder to win the freedoms in the US for which they fought abroad. And the first landmark decision, and court decision, that is Brown v. Board of Education, which rules that segregation in public schools violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And at the same time, on the continent of Africa, you see nations trying to shrug off colonial rule. And for the most part, they gained that. There were a couple of outliers, but between 1954 and about 1965, most of those African colonies become independent, self-governing nations. Same time, we get the Montgomery bus boycott, the Little Rock Nine integrate the public high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And in 62, 63, this is when James Baldwin writes the essays that make up The Fire Next Time. This is a pretty active time in the civil rights movement. You have the March on Washington, in which Martin Luther King makes his I Have a Dream speech. You have the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. And then, of course, after this book comes out, you have the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and then the assassination of Malcolm X, and later on, the assassination of Martin Luther King. And it was after this that James Baldwin fell into despair, and he attempted suicide in 1969 and had to find reasons to hope again to pull himself out of that. So that is my completely non-inclusive timeline to what surrounded this book and what kind of led up to it. So there you go.
And what, when we were talking about this, what I'm wondering, friends, and write it in the chat, what in that timeline, what stood out to you? And maybe we'll have Sister, if you toss it back up again. And but what stood out? What made you say, "Oh, I didn't know that," or "Oh, that touched me," or "Oh, that's not good"? What stood out in that timeline? I'm sorry, Sister Via, to try to make you share that again. That might take us till 7:45. But.
Oh no, it'll only take me a second now.
All right, so we've got the the colonization of Africa as a parallel, right? I was clueless about that. Sister V started talking about that the other day. I was like, whoa. Yeah, 25 years. Yeah, right? The civil rights movement. Black liberation is a worldwide movement. Super interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately in school, we usually get just one side of things. We only get the American history. We don't get it in a context of world history.
Yeah. What else? Sister V, you want to toss it up and see if we can look at it again? What else stood out to you?
Oh yeah, such a big proportion of the people kidnapped from Africa did not end up in the United States. Yeah. So Joanne asked why he moved to France in 1948. And let me share this while I'm answering that.
Two things at once. That's very impressive. Notice I say that without trying to share a thing.
Yeah, the expatriate movement in France, particularly after World War II, it was just considered so much more welcoming to Black people, that the level of racism was so much lower, that a small expat colony just, found itself there in particularly in Paris. Remember that Josephine Baker, after spending time in France in the Roaring 20s, she ended up being awarded a Legion of Honor by France because of her work in the French Resistance. So there was, a strong kind of expat Black presence in Paris, precisely to escape the racism in America. And it was also very creative. There's a lot of really creative people there at that time.
How eager the world was to enslave Black people. Right? I think the thing I was struck by, and I vaguely knew this, but was the notion that Black people outnumbered white people in, was it South Carolina and Mississippi?
Yep. Yeah.
And suddenly realizing, oh, white people were afraid because karma comes around.
Yeah, the fear of what goes around comes around.
Like,
yeah, I think Cindy just mentioned that. Oh yeah, that African American arts were accepted and appreciated in Paris. Cindy mentioned that that the first concentration camp actually happened on the African continent. Yeah, and it's so chilling, of course, that they decided to put Africans in cattle cars on rails, and that, of course, is repeated some 40 years later in the Holocaust. But they wanted the land and the resources, and they found that the Black people who lived there were an inconvenience to that. And much like the Trail of Tears here in the US, they just sought a way to move these inconvenient people off the land so that they could have it.
I love the idea from George, that notion that people who were training and organizing were always written off as socialists or communists.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And I think the other part for me is just how short Reconstruction was.
Yes, it's just a brief window between basically 1865 and 1877, where there's just this brief window where Blacks have political and social gains. And actually, the fears of whites. South Carolina had the largest Black population. 57% of their population were African American. They ended up with the most Black representatives in the US Congress. And that was part of the backlash that really, caused the Ku Klux Klan to rise, was, oh my goodness, there are actually Black people in the US Congress in this state with a majority Black population. And it just caused a backlash.
Or a blacklash.
Yeah.
And I think one piece that you don't have that I had just learned recently was the presence of the Ku Klux Klan in determining the Democratic platform. And I forget what years that was. But it was super influential in the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Right. So I thought it would be helpful for us to just be able to get somewhat a quick kind of world history review. We'll have, or is it already up on the website? Do you know?
Anna put it up on the website already. She's on top of it.
Yeah. So it's there. I would invite you perhaps sometime, if you're doing some sort of congregational studies of some sort, not bad to have that timeline around, knowing that it's not complete, but I think it's illustrative. And I, someday, friends, when there's a time when we worship in our communities of faith in the buildings, I imagine that tacked up on a bulletin board. And some poor soul at coffee hour has nothing else to do and reads that and learns. There we go. But let's take ourselves any questions do you want to put into the chat? Are there any questions about this? We had moments of reflection, but any questions about the timeline before we launch into the book? All right. So here we go. And we're just going to do an overview of the first letter. Yeah. Yeah, so the notion of how the Nazis treated, looking to how the U.S. treats blacks. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and
round, good.
yeah. Baldwin was born in 1924. I think I saw that question up there. Yeah. So he's really a contemporary of both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. They're within 5 years of age of each other.
And he's writing this in 60. It's published in 62. And if I'm looking at the first couple of, like, maybe fifth, sixth paragraph, he's talking about his nephew's grandfather. It's a letter written to his nephew, and he says this. That he had a terrible life. He was defeated long before he died, because at the bottom of his heart, he really believed what white people said about him.
Yeah, that's such an interesting statement. And you made me think about it even more after our conversation yesterday.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, I mean, that could be viewed in two different ways. It's kind of a both and.
Say.
Here's this man who survived, and survived. Yeah, Carol, that's what we were talking about.
Carol, I had the exact same question. Right? So how does this make him holy?
Yeah, and I kept thinking about it after we talked yesterday, and I thought, Baldwin uses language, he can use it to mean two things at once. And I thought, what if he means that in the view of white people, his grandfather's holy because his grandfather doesn't fight back. His grandfather endures this terrible life. He endures that place where white supremacy has put him. But at the same time, I think, and he could be holy because he endured this terrible life and still did not become bitter. That they still managed to love one another, just as a matter of survival. So I'm kind of seeing both and, that in the views of white people, he was holy because he didn't break out of the place where he's put, but at the same time, he still managed to survive and love his family. I don't know. What do you think about it?
I mean, I would go with the latter. But what I love is that you go a couple of lines down later. He's like, neither you nor your father exhibit any tendency towards holiness. and he says, you are really of another era, part of what happened when the Negro left the land and came into what E. Franklin Frazier called the cities of destruction. So is it that they're not? I don't know. I'm still not happy with any of our explanations. I feel completely flummoxed by this. And I can see how someone wouldn't be holy because they come to these desolate places and places that are set up for you to fail. You're black, you're gonna fail. And so people are, so it's like, how I don't know. I could get lost on this and where holiness comes from. So I don't know. I'm waiting for a better one.
Well, it's interesting because Baldwin is talking to his nephew about someone he's never met. And in many cases, resistance is something that is not always apparent, but certainly in hindsight, in trying to explain his legacy, or rather where they come from, the idea of him speaking of holiness speaks to the image of someone who had the fortitude and forthrightness to be able to survive. And to the extent that that he set a pattern for other generations to follow. So yeah, there was sacrifice. There was a great deal of sacrifice, but he also did not say he was defenseless. He didn't say that he didn't resist. He said he made sure that there was ability to ensure the next generation move forward. And I think to a certain extent, we hold people in retrospect at a certain level of, I won't say on a pedestal, but certainly in a certain, to a certain height of respect, and supposedly trying to determine that as a model to follow rather than the streets, as Baldwin later on speaks about the desire of people to fall into the street life. So just something to think about, because I think to try to think that this man who Baldwin is talking about, his great-grandfather, the nephew, was not a person of dignity or trying to do anything other than to move in a world that denied his own humanity, and still persevered to ensure that he set a pattern for those to be able to move on, is somewhat a misnomer.
Yeah, one of the other things I thought of when we're kind of wrestling with this is the basis of the word passion. When we think of Passion Week, it's passio. Mm-hmm. It's, this idea of surrendering to the circumstances in order to move on to something that's better and more whole. And, looking at what his grandfather had to just get through. I mean, we're looking at that timeline. You're looking at Jim Crow. You're looking at, the rise of lynching, the end of slavery, just getting through that without despairing and still, loving his family, loving his children, and giving them something to build on. There's some holiness in that.
Yeah, I think on some level, I guess the piece that Baldwin is saying is you can only be destroyed if you actually believe what the white people say you are.
The grandfather was, for a number of years, a Sunday preacher at a storefront church. And indeed, James Baldwin himself became a preacher in his teens.
Yeah, it was like 3 generations of preachers in their church. The grandfather,
that's
Baldwin's father.
That's by definition holy, right?
Well, yeah. I don't know about that.
Yeah. But you know what? I'm looking at what Joanne and Jerry Hardy have got, and that notion of so you want to be respected by the white people. And he was well respected by the white people in an obituary.
Yeah, and because Baldwin is talking about, seeing yourself in, he later on this letter that, you don't have to ask white people to accept you. You don't have to be what white people want.
Yeah.
But then he turns around and says, but you have to accept them, and you have to accept them with love.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets hard.
Don't give it all away. But I love, Donna Larkart's got, well played, Donna, with the notion of so because he is oppressed, is it then blessed are the poor in spirit, right? Blessed, that whole notion of first shall be last and last shall be first. Yeah, I wonder. Okay, Black holiness tradition. Okay, so all right, we're going to move past page 4, friends.
Well, as you said yesterday, this is a thin book, but it's very dense. There's a lot in here.
And so I find myself going over to the next page where we start hearing about um, the notion um, that I nor time nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. This notion that his brother barely survived, but that it is much worse. It is much worse, the crime of Baldwin's countrymen, us, me, white people. That we've destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. And this is what brought me to Advent, friends. And I went to the hymn, one of my favorite, Sleepers Awake. And I'm just thinking, oh, Perry, time to wake up.
Yeah, there's a question about this letter being Baldwin's way of having the talk with his nephew. And I looked at this letter as, that sense of, okay, I'm sending you out as a lamb among wolves. What do I want you to know before you're put out into this world, which he calls it loveless. and yeah, this idea that, wow, what do I want this child that's named after me to know before he has to face what this world has in store for him? And that idea of lives being destroyed, he tells his nephew, look, our society, white supremacist society, has put you in a place that you're never supposed to get out of. He says you're not supposed to aspire to excellence. You're supposed to be content with mediocrity. Yeah.
And then you go one more page, and this is where the introduction, of the phrase, it is the innocence which constitutes the crime. For white people to continue to say, it's the passive voice, right? Bad things may have happened, or even bad things have happened, but never the claiming of, I was part of this. I am part of this. And that notion to my need as a white person to hang on to my innocence. I didn't do that. That's not me.
There's also the notion of the consequences of wealth derived from what's happened in the past. So you look at insurance companies and investments they've gotten, and the fact that there are policies written on African Americans as value, as chattel, that the wages that were created from hired skills tradespersons who were carpenters and millwrights and all those kinds of things during a period of time which they could not claim that as their own to their own benefit. The idea that land that was I can go on and on. So this touches me deeply because I've lived through this. My family has lived through these kinds of situations where that you try to do the right kinds of things, and you try to do well, you live up to certain standards, and no matter what, there's always some hesitation on being accepted, or some hesitation on, is this legitimate? And I say that as a person who has been an educational professional, who has been a college president, who has been around many places, and still am always questioned as to, but did you get there the right way? Yeah. Are you the right fit for what it is that's going on. And so this comes very close. So I get very passionate about this stuff here. So I'll take a step back and just listen.
Yeah, someone in the comments, one of my favorite sentences in here is when he's saying to your nephew, here you were, we're holding in your arms, and you were here to be loved in order to strengthen you against the loveless world. And if we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. It's that sense of, this is what little we had and what got us through. And when you go back to that timeline, kind of speaking to what George Swan just said, every time there was even the remotest chance of building any kind of generational wealth, any kind of way to build one another up that way, it was taken away. So the brief window of Reconstruction, and then all of a sudden, they end up sharecropping. They can't really own land. They come north. You have something like, the Tulsa race riots, where this prospering Black middle class gets everything destroyed, and it just kind of happens over and over again. And Baldwin is saying, you were born and faced the future you faced because you were Black and for no other reason. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. Yeah.
And then it's the innocent country that has placed you, has set you down in a ghetto.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it's everything aligns for you to get shoved there.
May I add something?
Yeah.
With what Mr. Swan said, what you've lived through, all your accomplishments, they question how you got there. Were you this? Were you that? It's the same thing with President Obama, how he got where he got, and Trump. They accept anything from Trump, and they have. But Obama was questioned, was that, well, whatever. It's the same thing right now.
It was interesting that that Baldwin talks about, and I think it's on page, it's on page 8. And he talks about, he says, there's no reason for you to try to become like white people, and there is no basis whatever for their assumption that they must accept you. So there's this idea that Baldwin is saying, you have to be who you are, and you can't right now worry about that acceptance, because you've really got to work on who you are. And, at the end of this letter, he says, this celebrate, because he's writing this letter as 100-year celebration of emancipation. And he says, we're celebrating it 100 years too soon because it hasn't happened yet. This is still where we are. And so, there's this sense of telling his nephew, you're going to have to be who we loved you to be, who we strengthen you through that love to be. And you can't worry about white acceptance right now because it's not going to be there.
And I don't think I think it's even deeper than that. I don't think he would say that white acceptance is not even something to which you would aspire. I mean, the quote that you just read is saying that it is not, it's the assumption that you are some form of humanity that needs to be judged by some other form of humanity to be deemed acceptable by their standard or by their norm is fundamentally not just unbiblical, and it is a denial of, which is what George said earlier. It's about a denial of humanity. All of these things that take place of housing and schools and, questioning Obama's birth, at the root of them is a fundamental belief that being Black is not the same in a human value construct as being white.
Yeah,
And so once you've, I mean, that's what he's saying to his nephew. He doesn't, he would never, ever, ever suggest that there's any merit or desire or moral founding to wanting to be accepted, because that presumes a premise that's itself a lie.
If you, Anthony, if we go a little farther and then responding to the other comment, it talks about that the Black man functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star and an immovable pillar. And anytime the Black man moved, or the Black person moved, then that made the white people like, whoa, you just messed with my universe.
Yes.
And I think that's the piece, that's the backlash, right? And I think that's part of the backlash we saw with President Obama being elected. It was like, whoa, what are you doing there? And I think they're collectively, unconsciously, and consciously, it shifted the landscape and brought some of the guilt to the innocent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think what I love about Baldwin's work, speaking to what you just said, is his sense of the value of humanity, of being human. There's a link on our webpage to a podcast by Throughline. And Baldwin at one point says, there is absolutely nothing more valuable than a human life. And he reclaims that humanity that's been denied, time and time again for Black people in America. And as we've seen, Black people around the world. And Baldwin just really fiercely claims that humanity. And he claims it with the sense of love. and that's what I really, really love about this work and his work overall.
Because he's talking at one point about it's not so much your inferiority, but their inhumanity and fear.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, the details and symbols of your life have been deliberately constructed to make you believe that what white people say about you. Remember that what they believe does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and fear. And you and I are talking about, well, what are the symbols of,
I'm like, okay, so just rattle some off for me and I'll be, boom, 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 there's Sister V, boom.
Your underfunded schools, your poor housing, the fact that more pollution, in more polluting industries are put in your neighborhoods, all of these things
Red
that
line in your neighborhoods, that just, it's in the chat, but
yeah.
Insurance, right? My insurance doubled. I have a really good driving record, doubled, moving from the city of Chicago to the city of Detroit.
And so there's all these constructs and symbols that kind of just reinforce this idea of inferiority. Good grief, the Flint water crisis. When someone says, why should we have to pay that much money for you to have clean water? It's just this repeated, kind of societal structure that says, that tries to reinforce this idea of inferiority, but what Baldwin says is just actually a sign of inhumanity and fear.
Sleepers awake.
Yeah, and that and in many ways this letter kind of encapsulates the conclusion and kind of the arc of the book. And the sentence toward the end, it kind of goes from page 9 to page 10 in my book. He talks about integration. He says, this is what it means, that we, meaning Black people, with love shall force our brothers, meaning white people, to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it.
And from that, Sister V, you had the great Barbara Brown Taylor quote. So go be theological, friend.
Go be theological. Yeah, Barbara Brown Taylor talked about the fact that Jesus raised a mirror to society and constantly raises a mirror to us. And this mirror is so truthful, it makes us see us for who we are and what we've done. And it gives us a choice. We can either change what gets reflected in that mirror, changing ourselves, or we can choose to break the mirror. And over again, people who have wielded power choose to break the mirror rather than change what they see reflected in it. And Baldwin is saying that, you know what? We're here to be that mirror so that white society can be constantly confronted with who they are and then begin to change it.
Because the innocents who believed that Black people's imprisonment made us safe are losing a grip on reality. And I think that is so much. I think so much of that is there's that's part of the fear and the anger and the polarity of our country, at least a chunk of it.
And one of the reasons I like having this during Advent, here's my bit of incarnational theology. God becoming human, all of a sudden, here is the human face of God. And we have to look through the eyes of a human God and try to, we still can't really completely wrap our heads around this fully human and fully divine thing. But there it is, God incarnate in humanity. We look at other human beings and we have to realize that's the face of the image of God.
And
how do we address it? How do we love that? How do we help people who've lost sight of that image to the point that they can oppress someone else? How do we help them find that image within themselves so that we can change the world?
he says you accept them with love, for these innocent people have no other hope.
Yeah.
To V, could also say just a little modification as opposed to seeing Christ in themselves, seeing Christ in others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that all of a sudden takes away from the sense of ownership, and it's a collective type of piece, as opposed to saying, I'm going to be very, Christ is mine. No, Christ is all of ours. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I was telling the bishop I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, where Serene Jones, who's the president of Union Theological Seminary, she's talking about
very good seminary, I might add. Seminary. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Keep going.
Well, she's talking about what had to be diminished and broken within white people in order to enable them to impose and inflict the kind of suffering that they do and did on Black people. And how do we lovingly, in Baldwin's words, help white people to see that brokenness so that it can begin to be healed? Because, as he says, that's the only hope that all of us have.
Yeah. And for white people to have these moments of awakening, and I just go back to my own small one, you know, and it was this summer, and I'm on the phone with Sister V, and I said, "So is your life really like that?" I'm a goof, friends. I'm a goof. But I got this glimpse, and then I thought, oh, and she just said, "Yeah." I had some work to do.
Well, so any other kind of closing thoughts and comments you guys want to put into the chat there? Because you guys have had great ones.
I know, right?
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Wonderful. This is Jackie Phillips from All Saints. I'm not in the chat. I'm on the phone. So in listening to the conversations and the comments, I sort of feel like how James Baldwin is talking. You all are in a clique, a bubble. You're on the Zoom. You're reading the chat. And I'm on the outside, knocking, sort of like Ralph Ellison, the Invisible Man. I'm here, but I'm not really here because no one can hear me. So when I read this letter, I read this when I was in college. So reading it again is a different perspective because I'm more of a mature, seasoned adult.
Right.
But in looking at the feelings, it still brought me back that it's sometimes, even though James Baldwin is writing in a black and white, definitive manner,
Yeah.
there's still so much gray that in order for me to love you, in order for a white person to see a black person, in order for a black person to see themselves, we have to address the invisibility cloak that we have put on ourselves in order to function, in order to mask the pain that we may feel every day. And it's easy for a person who's not in pain to tell another person how they should be in a normal sense. But we're all, to a degree, working on a brokenness to get to a different place. And that's what I got from this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I love that.
Mhm.
And James Baldwin, I mean, he's writing from a place of pain. He really
Absolutely.
is. But yeah, thank you for that.
There is so much. There is so much to be seen when we actually look. And I think it's that decision that sometimes we just don't look. Yeah, and I love, Jackie, the image of the difference between the Zoom and the phone. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let's give a shout out to Jackie. Just only say, "Hey, Jackie, how are you?" This is George.
Fantastic. How are you?
Hey, fantastic. You know what? This also sounds when having courageous conversation means a certain level of discomfort. So
Right.
I made the observation that there have been a few voices that we've heard. There are many more of the 43 persons who we have not heard from. And it doesn't mean that everyone has to speak at one time, but certainly,
Oh, God, no, that would not be helpful.
I know, but courageous conversations creates this sense of discomfort, which is actually good because that's tension, that's constructive engagement, and the involvement of people in the examination of who they are and where they are in this world. And so thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Yeah. And amazing. We've only done 10 pages and we got all of this out of it.
So
But it also leaves you vulnerable, because when you make your statement, you can no longer hide behind the cloak of invisibility, because you make a statement, which in one of the pages, and I have an ebook, so it might not be the same page, but he talks about to act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. It could be danger in your opinion is not the popular opinion. Your stance is not the best stance, maybe for yourself or for your family. So in having courageous and critical conversations, you do leave yourself open. You do leave yourself vulnerable, and you may not receive your information, or your conversation may not be met with the same intent that you expect it to be.
yeah. Yep. And I think that is so true. And I think so we continue to venture forth bit by bit. We started with 400 years of history, bit by bit, but it's got to be a continuous working at it and working at it, and moving towards that vulnerability. So yeah, thank you all so very much for joining me and Sister V. It has just been one of my delights of being in our diocese, is to have these conversations with Sister V. I first met her on the search committee, and it is just, it's just very transformative. So I appreciate you all being a part of that. Next week, we're going to be here next Wednesday again. And remember, we're going to do about pages 15 through 47-ish. All right. And that wonderful timeline will be up. And don't forget, Anna put this out there as well. There's a great podcast on Baldwin. And so you can listen to that as well.
It's up there too. edumi.org/book study.
Thank you, Anna. So how about with that, I've got 2 closing prayers, if we might. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Oh, grant, oh God, that your holy and life-giving spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that the barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, hatreds cease, that our divisions be healed. We may live in peace and justice through Jesus Christ, our Lord. And watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night. Give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. Bless the dying. Soothe the suffering. Pity the afflicted. Shield the joyous. And all for your love's sake.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Friends, go in peace. Thank you so very much. Come back next week.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anna, thanks for your help. Sister V.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good week.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good to see you, Wilma. Hi, Betty.
Hi, who's saying that?
Debbie.
Hi, Debbie. Hi. Hi, Diane.
Hey, Wilma.
Hi, Debbie. Hi, everybody. Okay.
Hi,
everyone.
Betty.
Mhm.
Good to see you, Debbie. It's good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
Good to see you, Sister V.
Good to see you.
Always.
Good to see
Yeah,
you, Diane.
always. Thank you.
Hi, Nancy.
Okay.
See you tomorrow, Diane.
Okay. Who's that, Bonnie?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna go study now.
Oh, me too.
Bonnie Anderson, I think that's the longest I've ever seen your hair.
I
Oh,
know.
it's the longest it's been since I was in high school.
Yep. Yep.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Look at you.
Wow.
Oh, okay.
Okay, goodbye,
Very
everybody.
good. Bye now.
All
Bye,
right.
Diane.
Bye.
Bye, Betty.
Hi, Rosemary.